Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Galen Barbos. I'm with the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. In a second, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Naim Darghouth, who will be presenting the results of a recent study that we completed entitled Electricity Bill Savings from Residential Photovoltaic Systems, Sensitivities to Changes in Future Electricity Market Conditions. Before getting started on the webinar portion, or the substantive portion of the webinar, I wanted to just run through a few housekeeping items. First thing, we've got the webinar room reserved for 1 hour. So we plan to spend really the bulk of that time presenting material, but hopefully we'll save at least 15 or 20 minutes at the end for some Q&A. As far as Q&A goes, all of you out there are in listen-only mode. So if you have a question, we ask that you type it into the chat box. You should all see a chat box on the lower left-hand side of the webinar screen. So please just enter in your question there. And make sure that when you send it either to everybody or at the very least to the co-presenters so that we can see those questions. And then when we get to the end of the talk and have the Q&A session, I'll have compiled those questions and I'll ask them to Naim. And I guess with that, I will turn things over to Naim. First, let me just give a little bit of an introduction. Naim is a Principal Research Associate in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at LBNL. Naim conducts research and analysis on renewable energy policy, including electricity rate design and its impact on the value of residential renewable energy systems, such as we'll be talking about today, as well as more generally research on the economics of renewable energy technologies and federal and state energy policy issues. So with that, I will turn it over to Naim, and he will present the results of this recent study.
Great. Thank you, Galen. And thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. Today I'll be going over the principal findings from our recent report titled Electricity Bill Savings from Residential Photovoltaic Systems, Sensitivities to Changes in Future Electricity Market Conditions. The author of the report was myself, Naim Darghouth, Galen Barbos, who we just heard, and Ryan Weiser. I'd like to thank both Galen and Ryan, my co-authors, for this study, as well as acknowledge our funding from the Solar Technologies Program within the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy and Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability of the U.S. Department of Energy. So let's get started. So here is a quick outline of today's webinar. First, I'll be relating this work to some of LBNL's previous work in the area. I'll then provide some of the motivations for the work. I'll go through our general approach, as well as some of the limitations and boundaries to the work. I'll introduce the future wholesale market scenarios that are used in the analysis, our methods, and then go through some of the principal results and implications. And we'll finish with a question and answer session, as Galen noted. So in June of last year, my colleagues Andrew Mills and Ryan Weiser came out with a study looking at how the incremental value of variable renewables is impacted by higher penetrations, which is driven by energy and capacity value, the value of the electricity generated and the value of the dependable capacity online during times of peak load. In short, they found that although solar has high value at low penetration, the marginal value of PV and CSP without storage falls as their penetration increases. They also found that CSP with storage has much higher value than PV and CSP without storage at those higher penetrations. Wind energy is driven mostly by energy value rather than capacity value. As we see on the figure here on the right, at lower penetrations, wind is worth less than PV, but at high penetrations, wind is worth more. Let me get into a bit more detail about the model used in the Mills and Weiser study, as we actually make use of this capacity expansion dispatch model developed in the present study that we're presenting today. Renewable resource Capacity additions are fixed as per the scenario definitions, as is legacy generation that has not retired as of 2030. The model then co-optimizes conventional generation additions for both energy and ancillary services, taking into account operational constraints and hourly time resolution to determine scenario-specific long-term generation investments and the hourly wholesale market prices. The model assumes economic equilibrium. In most hours, wholesale prices are set to the marginal cost of the most expensive generation needed to meet the total hourly load. However, the wholesale market modeled is an energy-only market design. And so during peak load hours, wholesale prices can increase to levels above the marginal cost of the most expensive generation. During these periods, all plants that are generating are assumed to earn high scarcity prices. Peaker plants recover all of their fixed costs during those hours, and the resulting wholesale prices allow new conventional generation to recover exactly their fixed costs. Also previously, we published 2 reports looking at how current rates impact the bill savings from PV under net metering and potential alternatives. One was focusing on commercial customers and the other focusing on residential customers. Particularly, the residential study highlights the variability and uncertainty in the value of bill savings under net metering. It also considered a number of alternatives to net metering based on an avoided cost rate and found that depending on the exact compensation mechanism, PV could need additional support to enable continued market growth, potentially accounting for benefits other than avoided energy costs. The commercial study looked at other issues not present with residential rates, such as demand charges, and found that the marginal value of demand charge reductions decline with increasing size of the PV system. It also found that demand charge design impacts the value of PV generation greatly with commercial systems. So these findings really highlight the significance of rate design and net metering to the customer economics for PV for a variety of customers. These provide a good backdrop for the current study. So today in the U.S., residential PV systems are almost all compensated through net metering, effectively compensating PV generation at the customer's prevailing retail rate. Often, it's assumed that retail rate structures and net metering will remain the same in the future, and that retail rates will either stay the same or increase over time, keeping constant or increasing the bill savings from a PV. Rarely are changes in retail rates considered in the payback time calculations of residential PV. In this study, we investigate the impacts of 3 interrelated sources of uncertainty in the future value of bill savings from residential PV and how these 3 interact. These 3 sources are: 1, electricity market conditions, for example, varying solar penetration or natural gas prices. 2, retail rate structures. In our case, we're looking at 3 kinds of retail rates: the flat rates, the time of use rates, which we also call TOU, and real-time pricing rates, which we also call RTP. The third is PV compensation mechanisms and net metering. The impact of net metering versus an alternative to net metering is considered here. So the report here builds on literature that has investigated different aspects of net metering, rate design, and impact of renewable energy on wholesale prices. A number of studies have investigated different parts of this theme, namely the impact of electricity market scenarios on wholesale market price profiles and retail electricity rates have been looked at from various angles by Lamont, Sensitivities et al., Weiss et al., and of course Mills and Weiser, among others. A number of papers have also looked at the impact of retail electricity rates on the value of bill savings from PV systems, including work by Bornstein, Mills et al., Ong et al., work by E3, as well as Darghouth et al., our own work. Separately, there have been publications looking at the impact of behind-the-meter PV compensation mechanisms on the bill savings from PV. However, we haven't come across an analysis that focuses on how these different impacts interact. And this was really the primary motivation of this current study. So let me give you a general takeaway message of this study. First, we find that in certain conditions, future electricity market conditions, retail rate structures, and whether net metering exists as it does today can all interact to have a significant impact on the value of bill savings in the future from residential PV, and hence the private customer economics of behind-the-meter PV. As PV stakeholders, which includes lawmakers, state and federal regulators, electric utilities, solar industry, and potential owners of PV, as these stakeholders all consider the economic attractiveness of future PV, they will need to pay close attention to the rate design and PV compensation methods and consider a more in-depth and site-specific analysis. Finally, the assumption that bill savings from PV will remain the same or increase with time may not be a safe assumption and deserves a careful scrutiny depending on local conditions. Let's walk through the general approach. So first, using the capacity expansion and dispatch model developed by my colleagues, we simulated 1 year of hourly wholesale electricity market prices for a variety of electricity market scenarios. We then calculate 3 potential retail rates for each of the electricity market scenarios based on the wholesale market prices. These are a flat rate, a time of use rate, and real-time pricing. We use standard retail rate principles to develop these rates and assume that all the rates recover all the costs associated with serving total residential load. We also develop a flat rate with increasing block pricing for the reference scenario. Assuming 2 compensation mechanisms, net metering and hourly netting, which I'll be explaining a bit later, we calculate the bills and bill savings for 226 residential California customers in our sample for each combination of electricity market scenario, retail rate, and PV compensation mechanism. The metric we use here is bill savings from PV, and it's calculated by taking the difference between the bill without PV and the bill with PV and dividing this by the total annual PV generation. So before delving into more details, I'd like to take a bit of time to describe a few of the study's boundaries and limitations. So first, this study focuses on the private value of bill savings for residential PV. Though we recognize that PV may have a number of other benefits that are not quantified explicitly here, we are not considering any societal or utility benefits and costs resulting from behind-the-meter distributed PV. Next, we are relying on a variety of assumptions, some of which are inherently uncertain as they deal with future retail rate structures. Though we base a number of our assumptions on the potential electricity markets in future year 2030 in California, this work is not meant to be a forecast or a prediction of the California electricity market in 2030. Rather, we use California as a loose case study to explore the interactions that I discussed in the earlier slide. The conclusions have broader impacts, but some of our exact findings are specific to our assumptions. For example, we assume that fixed costs are recovered through a volumetric adder rather than a fixed customer charge. We also consider a single potential alternative to net metering, though a number of potential alternatives could have been looked at. However, to make the results more manageable, we needed to limit the scope of the study and hence could not look at all potential assumptions considered. And finally here, we're using an economic investment and dispatch model to simulate wholesale electricity profiles in a future year. Now, this model assumes an energy-only market design, which implies that prices are allowed to rise to very high levels, above marginal costs, to ensure that the peaker plants can recover their costs without need for a parallel capacity market. This makes the results potentially sensitive to few hours in the year, particularly for time-varying retail rates. let me introduce the wholesale electricity market scenarios that we considered in this study. For each scenario, we simulate their impacts on hourly wholesale market prices. All scenarios are loosely based on a California electricity market in 2030. We've assumed a constant load growth of 1.2% per year since 2010, bringing total load to 341 gigawatt hours annually in 2030, but retaining a similar load shape as 2010. We also assume that residential load accounts for roughly a third of total retail load and has a different evening peaking shape load than the overall load, as the case is currently. We also assume that each of the scenarios include the same amount of legacy generation capacity available for use, assuming that some of the generation available today has retired, but the remaining is utilized if economically profitable to do so in 2030. So the reference scenario assumes a 2011 level of renewable energy. That is, 2011 levels of gigawatt hours produced of solar, wind, biomass, and geothermal generation, not scaled up to load growth. The reference scenario is not intended to represent the most likely scenario, but rather serves as a baseline against which the other scenarios are compared. We then investigate the effect of changing a single market characteristic relative to the reference scenario in our isolation scenarios. For example, we look at the impact of an increased PV penetration alone, or high natural gas prices on the retail rates and the value of bill savings from PV. We then explore a scenario with 33% of load met by renewable generation. And this may be maybe a more realistic scenario than a high penetration of any one renewable. It's unlikely that we reach 15% PV penetration without any growth in wind or concentrated solar power, for example. The final scenarios considered are the variations of the 33% renewable mix scenario. 3 variations to the core 33% renewable mix scenario reflect resources that could be added to the grid to integrate high levels of renewable energy. These are also scenarios with higher levels of grid-level storage, one with demand response, and one with greater levels of concentrated solar power with storage. Here are some of the specific assumptions used in each of the scenarios. So we see the percent penetration of each of the renewables is considered in the reference case over here. Most assumptions stay the same through each of the isolation scenarios, except for one change. So, for example, the high PV penetration brings generation up to 15% of total generation over here. And it's a mix of behind-the-meter distributed generation and utility-scale generation at various targeted locations throughout the state. The high wind case increases the wind penetration to 15% also over here. We consider a carbon price scenario where the price of carbon per ton is set to $50. And the high and low natural gas prices here are based on EIA's forecasts under various scenarios. So the 33% renewable energy mix represents a more balanced mix of renewable electricity generation with an equal amount of wind and solar from PV and CSP with storage with 6 hours. So 11.5% of wind and 11.5% of PV and CSP with storage. We also slightly increase the levels of other renewable energy, including biomass and geothermal in this category here. Now, the integration scenarios take this 33% scenario and change a single market characteristic. The high storage, for the high storage scenario, the amount of increase pumped hydro goes up to about 10 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage capacity. The demand response scenario crudely models demand response as an increase in the total elasticity of load, an increase to negative 0.1. And the increased CSP with storage scenario increases concentrated solar power while decreasing the level of PV, holding the overall amount of solar constant. So we calculated 3 retail rates for each wholesale market scenario that I just presented. These are the flat rate, the time of use rate, or TOU, and real-time pricing, or RTP. Each of these was created using standard rate design principles, and I invite you to read through the report for more details. Each rate, again, assumes that all of the utilities, variable and fixed costs, are recovered through volumetric charges. More specifically, the costs that are recovered are: 1. One of the elements recovered through a volumetric charge is the transmission and distribution infrastructure costs. Though these are fixed costs, most residential rates today recover these as volumetric charges. And we choose to also do so here to retain rate structures that are similar to what's in place today. 2. We assume that any legacy nuclear and large hydro generation is owned by the utility, and hence the costs to run and maintain the plants, as well as any fuel costs, are recovered in rates through volumetric adder. 3, the renewable electricity purchases, we assume that renewables are purchased at a constant price through power purchase agreements, and these purchase costs need to be recovered in a retail rate through a volumetric adder. Now, the last element of our rates is the electricity load, which is not met by utility-owned or renewable generation, is assumed to be purchased on the wholesale market at the wholesale electricity price. And this cost, again, is recovered through a volumetric charge also. So we considered 2 compensation mechanisms for behind-the-meter PV in this study, as I had mentioned: net metering and an alternative to net metering, which we call hourly netting. So with net metering, all PV generation is effectively compensated at the retail rate, regardless if it instantaneously displaces consumption from the grid or not. This is similar to the way net metering is implemented today in many states. The PV generation does not need to be at the same time as the consumption for it to displace consumption. With hourly netting, the portion of PV that displaces load is compensated at the retail rate, but any excess PV generation within any hour is paid at the hourly wholesale price. The figure here shows gross load, those are the purple squares, net load, the red triangles, and PV generation, the green diamonds, all for an average customer from our sample. On the figure here, both the shaded areas are compensated at the retail rate with net metering, but with hourly netting, the blue shaded area would be compensated at the retail rate, whereas the orange shaded area would be compensated at the wholesale price. In this slide, I'm going to quickly go through the customer load and PV generation data that we used in bill calculations. We have the measured hourly load for 226 residential California customers and have matched simulated PV generation data to each of these customers to calculate the bills of each of these customers with and without PV. For most of our analysis, PV systems are sized to meet 75% of the customer's annual load. We say that this has a 75% PV to load ratio. Some results for 25 and 50% PV to load ratios are also presented. The figure here shows net and gross hourly load for the customer's mean day as a percentage of gross daily customer load for an increasing PV to load ratio. So we present for 25, 50, and 75% PV to load ratios. The figure, so first, there are a couple things to note on these figures. The first is the gross and net load profile peak in the evening hours, which is not the same as the overall system peak times. Second, we see that an increasing portion of hourly PV generation is greater than the hourly load. Under hourly netting, this implies that a greater percentage of PV generation is compensated at the wholesale price. So this slide provides a general overview of our results, which summarizes a number of our findings in a single figure. For each of the 226 customers we have in our sample, we calculate the bill savings from PV for each scenario, so each of these scenarios down here, each rate option, and PV compensation mechanism. This figure shows the median value of bill savings for each combination of retail rate, PV compensation mechanism, and scenario relative to the median bill savings under the reference case with a flat rate with net metering, assuming customers have a PV system of 75% PV to load ratio. So all these percentages here are relative to a single point, this point here, which is a reference case with a flat rate and net metering, which we calculated to be 17.9 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, this figure is a bit complex and summarizes many results and trends. So what I'll be doing in the next slides is isolating specific results and continuing to use this figure to point out some of our higher level findings, starting with looking at how the flat rate with net metering changes with scenarios. So our first finding is that a number of scenarios lead to an increase in the electricity costs relative to the reference scenario, either due to more expensive fossil fuel generation or the higher purchase costs of renewable energy. The increase in electricity prices leads to increases in the flat rate for most scenarios in order to recover costs, and this in turn leads to an increase in the bill savings value from PV. Under most scenarios considered, the bill savings increased by 1 to 13% relative to the reference case with the flat rate and net metering. The only exception is the isolation scenario with low natural gas price, and that one leads to lower electricity purchases costs for utilities and a 4% lower value of bill savings than under the reference case for PV compensated again via flat rate with net metering. The next finding, highlighted here on this figure, shows that for a number of scenarios, including the 15% wind scenario, the $50 per ton of carbon scenario, and the high and low natural gas price scenarios, the wholesale price impacts are relatively uniform over all hours, and hence the changes in retail rates are also uniform. As a result of this, the level of bill saving changes, but the magnitude of the impact is largely independent of the retail rate design or rate structure. Here, we see that for under hourly netting, shaded in light orange on your screen, the value of bill savings is lower in all scenarios considered than for net metering, shaded in yellow on your screen, regardless of the retail rate structure. Again, hourly netting, to remind you, is quite different from net metering in that it compensates PV generation that displaces hourly load at the retail rate, but any excess hourly generation is compensated at the hourly rate. Over most hours with hourly excess PV, wholesale prices are lower than the retail rate, whether they're flat, TOU, or real-time pricing, and this leads to a significant decrease in the value of bill savings. This decrease in value is more severe with increasing PV system sizes, as an increasing share of PV generation is in hourly excess of load. As a result, with a 75% PV load ratio, the bill savings from PV are 23 to 47% lower with hourly netting than with the full net metering option. And of course, this depends on the electricity market scenario and rate option. We also note that the spread among the three rates is greater among net metering than among hourly netting in the scenarios considered. This is explained by the fact that for hourly netting, the hourly excess generation is being compensated at the same rate, that is, the hourly wholesale price, regardless of retail rate structure, which makes the PV compensation profiles more similar for hourly netting. This figure here highlights the scenarios where there is not an increase in solar penetration relative to the reference case. We find here that the time-varying rates, so that is in our case time of use and real-time pricing rates, provide higher bill savings than the flat rate. This is because PV output tends to be positively correlated to summer peak and peak prices. In this case, PV benefits from time-differentiated compensation, though I should note that this would be different for a winter peaking load, for example. The time of use we modeled leads to a higher bill savings than real-time pricing because PV customers benefit from averaging wholesale prices over the entire peak time of use period. So the figure here shows the change in the value of bill savings from PV with increasing PV penetration for each rate option and PV compensation mechanism combination. The first thing to note is that the only rate option and PV mechanism combination that leads to a continuous increase in the value of bill savings is the flat rate with net metering, which sees a more or less linear increase in bill savings with increasing PV penetration. And this is due to the increases in electricity costs associated with the increased PV generation acquired. All other rate combinations lead to a continuous decline in the value of bill savings as PV penetration increases. The extent of the erosion in bill savings really depends on the rate combination. But we see that even at relatively low penetrations, there's a noticeable reduction in the value of bill savings. All the reductions are due to time-varying components that are related to the wholesale electricity prices, as these are lower than the reference scenario at times when PV generates. In this figure, I've shaded the rates with net metering for scenarios with high solar penetration. In all cases, it is the flat rate that results in the greatest value of bill savings, followed by time of use, and finally, the real-time pricing rate. Higher solar penetrations have a marked effect on wholesale prices. Specifically, the zero marginal cost solar electricity generation displaces more expensive peaker plants in the afternoon of the peak season, leading to a shift in the peak prices from the afternoon into the evening hours. This, in turn, leads to hourly wholesale prices being generally lower than average when PV generates electricity, which results in lower bill savings for time-varying rates. So in this case, time of use benefits from averaging over higher-priced hours within the peak period, and late solar generation will benefit from the higher prices than wholesale prices, making time of use more valuable to the PV customer than real-time pricing. The figure here shows the change in the value of bill savings for the three integration scenarios relative to the same rate and PV mechanism combination under the 33% renewable energy scenario. We can observe a relative increase in the value for most rates and compensation combinations. While other analyses have highlighted the potential for storage and demand response to integrate renewables, this analysis underscores the potential for storage and a form of demand response to augment bill savings from PV when in conjunction with high PV penetrations. As we know, with high levels of solar, customer-sited PV generation typically produces electricity when wholesale prices are comparatively low. Increased storage leads to reduced peak prices and increased off-peak prices, and this boosts the value of solar generation at the high penetrations. Another determining factor is a higher cost associated with both concentrated solar power and storage, which increase the volumetric adder in the rates designed to recover those costs. And as rates go up, of course, so do the value of bill savings from PV. So as a side analysis, we also modeled a scenario with a flat rate with an increasing block pricing under the reference scenario only, where the volumetric charge increases with consumption within a number of usage tiers. We based the tiers and steepness of the tiers modeled here on existing California utilities flat rates, and we found that, similar to our previous report, looking at net metering and existing retail rates in California, increasing block pricing with net metering can lead to high value bill savings for those customers with the highest consumption profiles, but low values for the households with lower consumption levels. We also find that customers with smaller PV systems tend to have higher values of bill savings than those with larger PV systems. This is because smaller systems can displace the higher tiers exclusively, whereas larger systems displace higher and lower priced tiers. So the main takeaway here is that if increasing block pricing were retained in the future, this would have a greater impact on the value of bill savings than many of the other uncertainties explored in the study. So this could quash a number of these effects that we've explored. So in summary, the conclusions that we can draw from these are as follows. So most generally, future electricity market conditions, retail rate structures, and the PV compensation mechanisms interact to impose substantial uncertainty on the future value of bill savings from PV. For this reason, single assumptions about rates that lead to an increase in the value of bill savings over time really may not be accurate. And more specifically, under scenarios with increased utility costs, bill savings with flat rates and net metering increase relative to the reference scenario, in our case by 1 to 13%. The impact of high wind penetration, carbon pricing, and changes in natural gas prices on bill savings from PV is largely independent of retail rate design. Hourly netting significantly erodes bill savings from PV relative to net metering. And in our case, we found it to eroded 23 to 47%. So for scenarios without an increase in solar penetration, TOU rates provide the greatest value of bill savings from PV. There are potential sizable declines in bill savings, even at relatively low PV penetrations. We saw some declines of up to 15% at 5% PV penetrations in our model, for example. For scenarios with high solar penetration, flat rates provide the greatest bill savings, sometimes 1 to 13% higher than the reference case. At high renewable penetrations, bill savings from PV increase with more storage, demand response, or concentrating solar panel with storage. And finally, increasing block pricing can lead to large variations in bill savings from PV. So this work really opens the way to a number of interesting issues that could be good to look at in future research. So I'm going to present a few of these ideas. First, it would be interesting to look at scenarios, rate designs, and PV compensation mechanisms not explored in this study. For example, one could explore the impacts of perhaps a different generation mix to California's, one with more coal, perhaps, on the rates and their impact on rates and bill savings from residential PV. A northwest winter peaking load would have an impact on rates, particularly in scenarios with a low PV penetration, and hence would be interesting for future work. One could also consider retail rates that recover fixed costs with customer charges rather than volumetric rates. This would most likely have a significant impact on the levels of bill savings as well as the relative levels from one scenario to the next. Another area that would be valuable is to investigate potential impact of customer strategies and technologies to maximize bill savings from PV. This could be done by installing behind-the-meter storage, to minimize hourly excess generation for hourly netting, for example, or shifting load patterns to make to try and maximize the portion of PV generation that is used instantaneously in order to minimize PV exports to the grid and the related lower compensation under a PV compensation mechanism like hourly netting. A macro study looking at how different changes to rates and PV compensation mechanisms could impact customer economics of PV and hence residential PV adoption and market size in the future would be an interesting study. A number of assumptions would have to be made on future costs of PV, which are, of course, very difficult to predict, particularly 10 to 20 years down the road. So this concludes my presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. I'll now turn it over to Galen, who's been collecting questions. Galen?
All right, thanks, Naim. And I guess maybe before getting into the Q&A, I did just want to note that for those that would like a copy of the presentation, feel free to email us. We also have, I guess, a slightly different version of the briefing posted up online already, and we'll be posting a recording of the webinar as well. So if folks are interested, please let us know, and we'll make sure you have access to those. So I've gotten a number of questions submitted over the course of the presentation. If folks have additional questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat window. And with that, let me get started on some questions. I've kind of been grouping them topically. So the first set of questions here have to do with hourly netting. And so let me just ask two of these since they're sort of related, Naim, and you can, I think, probably answer them both simultaneously. One is, it seems that with hourly netting, the utility is actually compensating the hourly excess electricity for less than it's worth, since solar has a variety of benefits other than energy and capacity value. For example, T&D avoided losses, avoided T&D infrastructure, environmental benefits, etc. Why did you choose not to include those in your analysis? So that was one question. And then a related one was for hourly netting, have you done any calculations using a renewable energy price rather than a wholesale price?
Okay, so yeah, they're related questions. Basically, we chose to compensate the excess generation within an hour from PV generation at the wholesale price, because we saw this really as a lower bound that a utility would compensate any excess generation. We do recognize that there are other potential benefits, so T&D avoided losses and the environmental benefits, as you suggest. But you know, we wanted to provide a lower bound to what this could be. So realistically, any compensation should be at least this level. For the second question, again, for the same reasons in the last paper that we wrote on net metering, we had considered the market price reference, which is often used to compensate or used to come up with a price to compensate generation, renewable generation. And again, we decided to use a lower price, a lower wholesale price to act as a lower bound.
Okay, let's see. We have a number of questions here related to kind of the rate design and rate structures that we modeled. I guess a couple questions that relate to how the timing of the TOU periods was defined, and especially how the peak period was defined. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So the time of use periods were calculated using a clustering algorithm. Basically, it's an algorithm that goes through to find the most likely clusters of high prices or low prices throughout the day. We have two day types, an off-peak and a business day and an off-business day. And within each of those day types, we have 3 period definitions, one for off-peak, mid-peak, and peak. And we basically use this clustering algorithm to optimize over all days where the peak period should be. So in fact, with the reference scenario, the time of use rate, the time of use period was found to be pretty close to what exists today in with the California utilities, from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. With 15% PV generation, however, the peak period calculated shifted to 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So really, almost after all PV generation has ended for the day. Yeah.
Okay. I think, yeah, we just had another question come in about why PV production isn't at peak load, and I think you more or less just explained that. We have a number of questions that relate to the sort of various 33% scenarios and different sorts of integration technology options that we considered. One question was, why not consider a scenario that includes more than one integration technology being utilized in combination?
Yeah, so definitely something that we could have done, but we wanted to look at the impact of any one technology to understand what is coming from which technology. It was the same rationale for the isolation scenarios, where we only looked at a single change, a single characteristic, to understand how that characteristic impacts the value of bill savings. Of course, future work, that's definitely something that could be done, particularly if there's reason to believe that there would be synergies between storage and demand response, for example, and maybe the value of bill savings could be greater than the sum of the two individual ones. So definitely something that we could do potentially. But we limited our analysis to these, and in part, we limited our analysis to limit the number of scenarios that we looked at.
Yeah, no, just to sort of echo that, I mean, as we were conducting this work, there were really kind of countless times during the research when we thought, oh gosh, it would be really cool to look at this or that or this and that in combination. And we just, kind of got to the point where we really had to sort of draw the line in the sand and say, hey, we've got, a lot of results here to show already. And I think as folks saw, it's a lot of information to kind of cull through. So undoubtedly there are many different sort of scenarios and conditions that would be very interesting to look at, including looking at multiple integration technologies in combination, and possibly that that may be fruit for some follow-on work. So we had a couple other questions. Let's see, related to, well, one more here related to rate design and the kinds of rate designs that we considered. Obviously, we looked at a TOU rate, we looked at a flat rate, we looked at RTP, we looked at inclining block rates to a limited extent, and then we kind of looked at alternatives to net metering. We had one question, though, that asks, why or when do you expect to model a straight fixed variable rate design, since this rate design is being considered as a viable alternative to decoupling?
Right. So we're talking about a customer charge, a fixed customer charge to recover fixed rates.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we considered we did consider using it again. For one of the reasons we didn't model it was because of the number of scenarios and rates that we were already looking at, and so we couldn't necessarily look at a lot more. And we also wanted to preserve some element of today's rate design. And though some utilities have looked at greater fixed customer charges, not too many, with the exception of a few, have been successful at convincing their PUCs or to do that. So we wanted to kind of reflect what we think may be a realistic scenario for the future. That said, we are working on a journal publication version of this article where we will have limited analysis and a discussion of the results of these really side analyses of one case, which will be the recovering fixed cost through a fixed customer charge rather than a volumetric rate.
Okay, let's see. Here's kind of just a technical clarifying question. Under the high DR scenario, did you assume customers actually shifted their demand or simply reduced total energy consumption?
So the result was we just used an elasticity of load. And so when prices doubled, their load went down by 10%. Overall, this actually resulted in a slight increase in demand because of the many very low price periods at evenings and weekends. So we did not do a more sophisticated load shifting algorithm. We just used a straight up elasticity method.
We have a question here. Do you plan to do a similar study for commercial customers?
For the moment, we are not planning on doing a similar study for commercial customers. I would be very happy to see one done and would be happy to talk to someone who would be willing to take that on. But in the short term, we do not have plans for doing a similar study with commercial customers.
Let's see here. We've got maybe time for one more quick question here. Let's see. So here's one. Looks to me like rate design has little impact if you go to hourly netting. Is that right?
Rate design has less impact if you go to hourly netting, because what's happening is a portion of the PV generation is not being compensated at that rate, but at another rate, in our case, the hourly wholesale scenario. So only a smaller portion of the PV generation is being compensated at the retail rates. And hence, yes, that's correct that there's less. If we were to move to hourly netting or something like hourly netting, retail rate would have less of a impact on the value of those savings. That's true.
Okay. All right. Well, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get through all of the questions, but it looks like we're out of time here. And before we close down here, I just wanted to call out to folks that the slide that's up on your screen now has a URL. And that URL will allow you to download the report. It will allow you to download the presentation. It will allow you to download a recording of the webinar. So all possible materials associated with this work should be available there. So we'll leave this up on the screen, and folks can jot this down if you like. If you don't have a chance to jot it down or something goes awry in your transcription, again, please feel free to send any of us an email, and we'll forward it along to you. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for your time and your attention and all the great questions. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting done. All right, Galen?
Here, I'm calling the operator.
Okay.